In this tutorial, I am introducing the very basics of HDR with two different exposures. I should note that if you've mastered HDR, this tutorial is not for you. HDR stands for High Dynamic Range, allowing us to bridge greater detail between shadows and highlights. In a minute, I'll show you what I mean. First, if you are planning on taking HDR seriously, I recommend that you get a sturdy tripod, a cable release, or put the camera on a timer and shoot raw files. Yes, you can shoot JPEGs, but why bother? Leave JPEGs for the web, where they belong. For this tutorial, I've made two different exposures in some of the worst lighting conditions. There's a huge contrast between the inside of the cave and the outside world. I would recommend more than two exposures, but since we are learning HDR for the first time, two exposures will suffice. I am going to select these two images, right-click on them, and open them in Camera Raw. Notice the thumbnails on the left side. Next, I'll examine my histogram to evaluate each image. I'll click on the shadow clipping warning, which is located on the left side of your histogram. This will allow me to examine the detail in the shadows. The blue color indicates that my shadows have no detail, which is why I have made the second exposure, which I'll come back to in a minute. Now I'll click on the highlight clipping warning located on the right side of the histogram. The red indicates blown out highlights, which means there is no detail. I can recover some of the detail in the highlights by using the highlight slider or the exposure slider. In this case, I'll use highlights. And I'll set it to, say, 0. You can also use the adjustment brush to select certain areas and underexpose or overexpose them. But that's something we'll cover in the next tutorial. So let's go back. Now I'll go to the second image and I'll ignore the highlights since the focus is on the shadows. And I'll open both pictures in Photoshop. I'll click Select All, and then I'll open the two images. Now I'll quickly arrange the document so that we can easily see both. I'll go to Window, Arrange, and then I'll click on 2 up horizontal. While holding the Shift key, I'll drag and drop the darker image into the brighter one. The Shift key allows me to place the second image directly above the first one. I don't need this image anymore, so I'll simply close it out. Notice that we are now working with two different layers. Turning the eye off or on will indicate the visibility of our layer. The outside is fine, so we need to recover the detail on the inside. You can simply erase the inside of the cave by using the eraser tool. However, I strongly urge that you work with a layer mask, which gives you more flexibility by allowing you to recover from any mistakes made. I'll click on the top layer, and then I'll create a layer mask by going to the bottom of my layers panel and by clicking on this little icon right here that says Add Layer Mask. Notice the white thumbnail. Now I'll select the brush tool. Next, we are going to focus on the foreground and the background color. Hitting the D key on your keyboard will reset whatever the colors are. The X key will allow us to toggle between the foreground and the background. Since the shadows must go, I'll need to delete or subtract in this case. Black subtracts and white adds. Therefore, the foreground must be set to black. I'll right-click to make the necessary adjustments to my brush. Make it smaller or bigger. I can change the hardness. At the top, I can change the opacity to whatever I need. Now I can start removing the unnecessary areas. And you can keep changing the size of your brush or the opacity if needed. If I mess up, say by going into this area, I can switch the foreground color to white and simply add it back. Just be careful when you get to the edges. Not everything needs to be completely removed. The trickiest part is when I get to these edges right here, where the blue shade seeps in. I tend to leave these areas in the dark. So I'll simply switch to white and I'll erase these areas and perhaps I can just soften them a little bit. Yes, I could use the history panel to undo some of my mistakes, but layer masks allow you to define and refine those minute details that history can only dream of. Once we are done, any final adjustments such as color can be made. When working with HDR, my goal is to make the scenes realistic. HDR can become complex, allowing us to create artistic imagery. However, if you're just starting out, I recommend that you shoot for realism first. In the process, we might discover that it's harder to make realistic images than the artistic ones. Artistic images can cover the flaws in our work, while realism allows little to no room for deception. To fake reality in photographs, one must master the craft which leads to it, something not achieved in this tutorial, but it's a start. I hope you get the point. Now go shoot different exposures of the same scene, layer it in Photoshop, and get rid of what is unnecessary. Go to our Facebook wall to find our article on HDR and HDR FX Pro 2. We'll see you next week.